Remember this guy? Mr. Butt? No, I'm being serious. His name is actually Kyle Butt. Or Mr. Butt if you feel like being more formal. You know, just out of respect. He had a brief stint as a villain on my channel in which he solved Bible contradictions, proved God, and broke the universe in my hour-long epic Into the Zodverse. I drifted away from him after he started to feel repetitive, but now that it's been a couple years, I decided to take a crack at one of his videos called Faith and Reason, Proof for God. It's this weird thing about how atheists are the ones with faith, or we all actually have faith or something, and while it's a groaner of a topic and not exactly high-hanging fruit, his tactics serve as a good example of how people bog down conversations with equivocation over what faith is, whether science has faith, and so on. So hopefully my breakdown can provide a little clarity for future conversations you find yourself in. Also, it seems like it would be a bit of fun, so let's go.
What is the relationship between faith and reason?
I wouldn't say there's a straightforward linear relationship between them, and any answer will depend on what you mean when you use each word. Reason in this context pretty straightforwardly refers to thinking logically on the basis of verified evidence to arrive at sound conclusions. We could pick over the phrasing, but I don't see us meaning anything too different from that. Faith, however, can be a much more slippery word. If it's confined to rationally justified trust based on past history, then sure, it can be part of a reasonable thought process. But if it involves belief in something without evidence, for example relying on assumption, a feeling, or a claim you've been taught but never examined, then it's almost definitionally irrational and will allow for assumptions that undermine someone's ability to reason clearly. But let's see how Mr. Butt tackles the problem of definitions.
Webster's dictionary says,
Oh, this should be fun.
That faith is a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. The American Heritage Dictionary says that faith is a belief that does not rest on logical or material evidence. Is that true? Is that what faith really is? That's what we're told.
That's a pretty selective description of what we are told, because different dictionaries will say different things about faith. In fact, any specific dictionary will say a lot of different things about faith because it's an imprecise word with a lot of varied meanings. Webster's gives definitions from strong trust to religious belief to fidelity, and you have to scroll pretty far down its entries to get to Butt's firm belief in something for which there is no proof. The American Heritage Dictionary has a similarly varied series of entries, more focused on religious belief, but doesn't even include Butt's definition. Now, I don't doubt his citation, though I also don't have a lot of faith in it, as he might have just been using a different edition of the dictionary. But it's pretty obvious he's zeroing in on some very carefully selected definitions. I'm always leery when people do this. It's usually a signal they're setting up semantics to make a misleading point, either by advocating for or rebutting a simplified definition. Also, I just want to point out that while Mr. Butt wasn't able to choose his unfortunate last name, he was able to choose the size of his shirt. That was a decision he made, says the guy wearing a Kirkland jacket with an orange hat pulled down over his face.
In fact, what we're told is that faith is contrasted with science.
I'm not sure it contrasts with science as much as it undermines science. Again, depending on the meaning of faith you're using. Now let's just see how long it takes him to f*** up the definition of the word science.
And we're told that modern science is a belief that is solely based in experimental evidence.
Well, that was quick. Science is not a belief. It's a systematic approach to gaining knowledge. Of course, like faith, it can have different usages. For example, if you're referring to a specific science being an area of study, but you're pretty far off the beaten path when you call science itself a belief. Also, maybe try to say anything about faith and reason before moving on to faith and science? You know, just to kind of tie up your loose ends.
And that faith is a warm, emotional, fuzzy feeling that somehow people hold in spite of the evidence or lack of evidence, and they just have it because their grandmother told them it was true or because it makes them feel good. But did you know that there are serious problems with this dichotomy between faith and reason and faith and evidence?
Sure, I guess. But before moving on, let's just point out that he so far contrasted faith with reason, evidence, and science, jumping between them as if they're interchangeable words. Now yeah, I could see how they all stand in somewhat similar opposition to faith, but they're different concepts that contrast with it in different ways. And the way he so haphazardly swaps them out with each other is a telling sign of how imprecise he's being. Back to the point though, we can't just broadly contrast the entire word faith with any of these words. If someone uses something they or we label as faith, we really need to flesh out what thought process the word is describing in their specific situation. Is it referring to their justified level of trust in someone or something based on past history? Then for that person, there might be no conflict between their faith and reason. But is it just blind belief in something their grandma told them? Then for that person, I would say that, yes, there is a conflict. To find out whether someone is being rational, you need to look at the details of how they're thinking or acting. And whatever you determine about their faith only applies to them. You can't just insist on a single rigid definition of a word that isn't used in a single rigid way and then apply it across the board to everybody who uses it regardless of how they're using it. If you did this with faith, you'd end up either mischaracterizing some people's rational behavior or denying the irrational behavior of other people by virtue of the broad definition you insisted on. And when an apologist like, say, this guy, spends this much time harping on the meaning of a word, they're probably doing the second one on purpose.
The fact of the matter is, modern atheistic evolutionary science is not evidence-based.
Oh boy.
And true faith actually is evidence-based.
Even if some definitions of faith can be construed as possibly rational, I'm really curious how someone could define faith in a way that makes it necessarily rational. Seriously, put that definition up on screen, but we all know he's not going to do that, right?
Atheist physicist Paul Davies made this statement. He said, "In science, we are repeatedly told it's the most reliable form of knowledge about the world because it's based on testable hypotheses. Religion, by contrast, is based on faith. The problem with this neat separation is that science has its own faith-based system. Clearly, then, both religion and science are founded on faith."
Okay, first off, I'm not sure Paul Davies is an atheist. He disavows organized religion, but hints at what sounds like some kind of ambiguous fence-setting deism, and he strikes me as being bound and determined to see religion and atheism as sides of the same coin. Second, regardless of whether he is an atheist, he says things about the implications of atheism and religion that are confused on a very basic level, and his examples of the faith of scientists include confidence that the world will keep acting in a consistent way, which is the most reasonable thing that can possibly be construed as faith, and in fact the only intelligent way to learn from our observations. It's also more of a pragmatic confidence than a philosophical one, and it's always open to revision as we observe more of the universe. This does not sound anywhere close to the version of faith employed by most religions. But we could even ignore all that and say, who cares of the fact that Butt showed us an unexplained assertion from what he says is an atheist? I mean, would Butt like to start accounting for every quote I could put on screen from a professing Christian? Because that could get weird for him real quick.
Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin stated, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of its patent absurdity of some of its constructs, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." You see, the atheistic evolutionary-based science that is purported to be based on facts and evidence and reasoning, well, it's not that.
As with Davies, I'm not sure I care what Richard Lewontin says. The orchard from which apologists can cherry-pick awkward philosophical quotes from scientists is huge. And I'm not going to explain myself every time they run up to me with a weird example and say, "What about this one, atheist?" Sorry, but quality control over that entire crop is not my job. But just to play Butt's little game, I take two things from this quote. One, Lewontin explains the fact that science is huge, unpredictable, and often unintuitive in what I would consider an imprecise way. And two, he says we can't let a divine foot in the door. This seems to be saying we can't default to easy mystical answers when science gets confusing, which I find to be perfectly reasonable. The absurdities of science arise from our confusion about what we see in a very complicated universe, and scientists try to make sense of that confusion through observation and sound methodology. God did it explanations bypass this actual learning process by just asserting easier answers that we're supposed to accept on, actual faith. But again, I've already put too much effort into an uncontextualized quote from a scientist and/or atheist.
Here's what I mean. According to atheistic evolution, at some point in the past, life arose from non-living chemicals.
Do we need to keep pointing out that abiogenesis isn't evolution? Feels like it's getting a little old.
And yet, every single scientific experiment that has ever been done proves that that cannot be the case.
Number one, no they don't. And number two, that's very much not how scientific experiments work. But if it were, these experiments would much more likely prove that life doesn't arise from the vocalizations of immaterial spirit beings. If we're going to play the "what does science not have a precedent for" game, then let's play it consistently.
Atheistic philosophy says that this universe had to arise from nothing.
Nope. Not agreeing to conclude your God did it isn't the same as saying it came from nothing.
And that would violate the law of cause and effect.
Oh, Jesus f***ing Christ.
Atheistic evolutionary teaching says that the life that supposedly came from non-living chemicals could change from a single-celled amoeba to multicellular bacteria and then to all of the organisms in the world. That's simply not scientific. You cannot find a place in nature where that is occurring and put your finger on it and say, this is a scientific fact.
You can, though. Unless you're saying we can't put our finger on a single point where all these cumulative changes are happening at once, in which case I guess that's true, but only in the same way that it's true you can't put a finger on the one point where a baby turns into an adult. Not exactly a useful observation.
And so what Lewontin is saying and what Davies is saying is that it's stated that science and faith or religion are separate because science is based on evidence and faith is not. He says, but that's not true. Science is based on some things that you absolutely positively cannot prove.
No, it's based on what we can demonstrate, even if tentatively, while acknowledging what we don't know. To whatever extent you can point out where science does rest on things we can't prove, it tries to keep these assumptions minimal and open to revision. This does not make it the equivalent of religion, which is based entirely on assumptions that it dives into head first and is not, let's just say, actively seeking to revise in the face of new evidence. This doesn't make science the same as religion any more than the fact that we've all said something false makes everybody a pathological liar. And if you take a step back from Butt's wordplay and look at what science and religion each actually does, this should be incredibly obvious.
But now, when I say science, put evolutionary atheistic teaching in science. But now here's what I would like to say. That real religion and true science are both evidence-based systems.
I have a feeling real and true are doing a lot of ambiguous heavy lifting in that statement.
In fact, when you look at the Bible writers presenting the religion of Christianity, on numerous occasions, they tried to make sure that we understood that the definition of faith was not holding something without evidence, was not a belief in something that we could not prove. In fact, it was the very opposite of that. Christianity is the belief in something for which you have evidence to validate the conclusion.
Considering the nature of the word faith, the Bible writers couldn't make sure we understood the definition as much as clarify which of the many senses of the word they are using. This is an important distinction to make once people start horsing around with wordplay. But even if it sometimes promotes a version of faith that relies on evidence, there are other places where the Bible, including in lines attributed to Jesus, encourages blind credulity and badmouths the idea of asking for evidence. But regardless, what the authors say about evidence is all talk. What I'm interested in is how much evidence they actually have. So let's look at that, huh?
Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, stated, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty." You see, people were accusing the apostles of following myths and fairy tales and making up stories or following cunningly devised fables. And what was Peter's solution? What was his answer? No, we're not. I have valid material evidence that proves what I'm saying. I was an eyewitness to Jesus' life and His miracles and His actions.
So, people thought the apostles were making up stories, and Peter's reply was, "No, we're not." That's unimpressive. Now, yes, the "no, we're not" is Butts wording, and I'm a little surprised he chose to paraphrase Peter in such a dumb way. But regardless of how they say it, the fact that someone bothers to pause and assure you, "I'm not just making this up," is not evidence of any kind whatsoever. It's more of a red flag. And that's setting aside the fact that 2 Peter was probably not written by Peter. The authorship of the book was already being questioned by church leaders in the earliest centuries of Christianity, and it's widely suspected to have been attributed to Peter by an anonymous author, most likely after his death. So this evidence is nothing more than how the early church chose to write its own narrative.
Luke, the author of the book of Acts, wrote that when Jesus rose from the dead, He also presented Himself alive after His suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them for 40 days. You read that in Acts chapter 1, verse 3.
Sure, you can read where the Bible asserts that. But so? I could write down that I prove stuff too. And if I did, I'd actually make up detailed descriptions. You know, so that my bald-faced assertions would at least sound compelling. The fact that the author of Acts instead just wrote, he offered many proofs, makes it sound like he wasn't trying and that his audience didn't even expect him to.
Now, the skeptic can try to assail the proofs that the Bible presents.
Asserts.
And that Christianity presents and say, no, that's not evidence and that's not evidence, although they will not succeed in that. But you cannot say honestly and legitimately that the faith of the Christian religion is something not based on evidence, when the early writers demanded that they weren't writing cunningly devised fables and they weren't presenting the resurrection of Christ without evidence.
So to sum up, Mr. Butt's point is literally that we can't deny evidence for Christianity because the early Christian writers demanded that they did have evidence. That's pretty weird.
Paul, the author of almost half of the books in the New Testament, once stood before the Roman official Festus, and he presented his case as to why he had faith in Jesus Christ. After listening to Paul's case, Festus said to him, "Paul, you're beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad." And Paul responded by saying, "I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but I speak the words of truth and reason." Notice that Paul claimed to base his decisions to follow Jesus on truth, what really is actually the case, and reason, proper thinking about that truth.
So first, to point out the incredibly obvious, this is just a Bible story, and the fact that the Bible tells us a story isn't proof of anything. I mean, otherwise they could just cut to the chase and point us to the story of the resurrection, right? But then even within that story, all Paul does is claims he's being reasonable after being called a crazy person, which isn't necessarily reassuring. So basically, Mr. Butt sums up a story that depicts a character claiming to tell the truth about another story and acts like it amounts to evidence. Is this what he thinks makes Christianity look good next to science?
Jesus' claims always were based on material evidence. He said, "I come and I'm explaining to you that I am God in the flesh, but you don't have to believe me just for my word and from my testimony, I do miracles that are evidence of my deity. The prophecies in the Old Testament that were written hundreds of years before I came are evidence of my deity. There was a voice that came out of heaven that Peter, you heard, that James, you heard, that testifies to my deity. I'm going to die and rise again the third day. That's going to testify to my deity. You see, Jesus never said, you need to believe in me because of faith, and that faith is not based on evidence.
Oh, like when he chided Thomas for asking for evidence of that very resurrection and said, "Blessed are those who believe without seeing"? Or responded to other people who asked for evidence by saying no? Or calling them wicked? Or evil and adulterous? Or reacted to some poor guy who just wanted his terminally ill son healed by bemoaning the fact that people won't believe without signs? Or responded to people asking him to show them God the Father with cryptic nonsense about how if they really knew him, they'd know the Father already? Or skirted a request for evidence with a weird comment about the weather and said they should already be able to interpret vaguely to find signs of the times before, in classic Jesus fashion, calling them wicked and adulterous for good measure? You mean all those examples of how Jesus never expected people to believe without evidence?
He said, you need to have faith in me, and that faith is looking at what is true, all of the evidence that's available that proves I'm God, and reasoning properly about that truth. You know, while it is true, many religious and scientific people hold beliefs by blind faith. That idea is completely foreign to the Bible. True faith requires that each person test all things and hold fast to what is good.
This is just silly. The idea of blind faith is most certainly not foreign to the Bible, and Jesus' repeated act of shitting on skeptics is just one example of that. But even if it were, so what? The story can safely show people being as skeptical as it wants, and pay as much lip service to that skepticism as it wants, because in the end it can just depict the supernatural thing happening. That's kind of how stories work. That's why, regardless of what's in the Bible, Christianity still requires unwarranted faith from its followers, since they live in the real world where you can't just write that the miracle happened. The Bible stories are meant to serve as examples for all these people who don't see miracles, assuring them that they did happen at some point, and they even convince the skeptics. This works if you unwittingly make the unwarranted assumption that the Bible is absolutely and literally true. You know, if you just have faith, and not the evidence kind of faith. That's what Buck counts on for the last part of his video. Really, the whole thing comes off as an attempt at gaslighting anybody who tries to point out the plain, obvious fact that Christianity relies on unwarranted faith. Buck does this by trying to get you to do three things. First, doubt your understanding of what faith is by leading you through a meandering discussion of the word that clouds the issue without making a clear point. Second, question your confidence in science by using semantics to exaggerate its assumptions and rambling through an elaborate assertion that evolution doesn't work. And third, confuse actual evidence for Bible stories by blurring the line between them. These are fairly common tactics that you might run into from time to time in conversation with believers. And while not compelling, they do create semantic confusion that can be hard to untangle right on the spot. Hopefully I fleshed out some core distinctions that you can keep in mind and that are in some way helpful. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, The Crowd Pleaser, A Little Logic, Daniel Bostet, Nademos, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.